Section 2 of our notes over the 1950s. Between 1940 and 1960, more than 40 million Americans moved to the suburbs, partly because of the shortage of urban housing. William Levitt became a leader in mass-producing suburban homes, and soon suburbs began springing up across the country. Suburban development depended on the support of the government, though. State and federal governments constructed thousands of miles of highways that linked suburbs to the cities. So we've mentioned this a little bit before. I doubt you remember. It's been a while since we talked about it, but cities started growing slowly outward. Kind of picture like if you throw a rock or something in a pond or something, it's kind of a ripple effect. So this is just another further ripple than we've been able to have before, because with more access to transportation and now better roads linking more of these cities together, people could live further and further away. They can afford their own homes because the Great Depression has ended. The GI Bill and the Federal Housing Administration were helping people get loans at a lower interest rate. And if you don't remember, in the previous chapter, we talked about the GI Bill giving veterans good rates on starting their own businesses in their own homes. So both of those things, and they could have been a construction business, or they could have been using it just to buy their own house, led to the need for more homes after the Second World War had ended. And this is also, if you don't remember from the last chapter, the beginning of the baby boom. So people really do need houses because they're having families for the first time. Post-war suburbs developed a greater sense of community than suburbs ever had before, and no longer depended on the cities for entertainment, shopping, or even emergency services like fire and police. So, the biggest city near us, true city, is Tulsa. And cities around it, like Broken Arrow, Jinx, you could say Bixby, you could say Owasso, you could even say us, are all suburbs of those bigger ones, right? So, and they have slowly grown over the years. I mean, you all are too young to remember, but Owasso is huge now compared to what it was when I was growing up, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. It looks totally different because they have started really building more homes and expanding the businesses they have there, and the roads are expanding as well, and you've experienced that a little bit just because the construction is still going on, but it is because it's become a suburb of that big city in Tulsa. Families want to live in Owasso and go to school there, but still be able to work in Tulsa. With the expansion of suburban growth in the United States, Americans were even more dependent than ever on their cars, and a love affair began between Americans and their cars. I think that still exists today. Most of your parents, if they commute to work, they probably commute in a car because we live in Skytech. We don't have sixes or undergrounds or anything like that. The scale of suburban growth would not have been remotely possible without a massive federal program of highway development. The Interstate Highway Act was passed in 1956, which authorized funds to build 41,000 miles of multi-lane highway. Eisenhower was essential in getting that passed since he was the president in 1956. Represented the biggest expenditure on public works in the United States history. Besides easing commutes from suburbs to cities, the new highways boosted travel, and it was also a boost in our level of security. Eisenhower ensured that the overpasses and the width of our lanes were appropriate so that if we needed to move military vehicles, we could do that. That was something that he definitely had his hand in, making sure we were prepared if we needed to move military vehicles around the country, that we could do that. By the mid-1950s, California passed New York as the state with the largest population, signaling the growth of the Sun Belt, which is the name given to the southern and western states. Many factors contribute to this migration. One of the biggest is the weather. California has a very appealing climate and a large number of jobs in the new booming defense industry. Aerospace, electronics industries, and all other industries brought people to Sunbelt cities, one of which would be Houston, right? NASA is based out of Houston. Many Mexican Americans, contributed to this population increase as well as they moved into cities instead of just rural areas. For the first time in American history, more people found employment in the service sector rather than in manufacturing. The service sector includes healthcare, law, retail, banking, and insurance. This new service sector workforce included many who worked in the information industries as well, including those who built and operated the first computers. The first computers, and we're going to watch some video over everything in this chapter, not just in this section. But the first computers are not like your Chromebooks, and they're not like your phones, which technically those really are computers. The first computers would take up rooms, like huge rooms. The first one, ENIAC, or one of the first ones, took up 18,000 square feet. That's like 3 basketball courts put together, right? So they were gigantic, not what you would think of today when you thought of a computer. More and more industries started using computers like hotels to make reservations and banks to keep track of accounts. Some even took the place and the jobs formerly held by people, and that's something we're still seeing today, right? A weird example, but one that you all experience probably on at least a weekly basis is self-checkout, right? You used to have to go and actually check out with a person and stand in line. Now it's honestly kind of hard to find a person sometimes if that's the route you want to take. So it is something that's becoming more and more common in today's world to see more and more computers take jobs that used to be held by people. We'll see kind of the repercussions of that, I'm sure. The number of women in the workforce doubled as well between 1940 and 1960. That might surprise you. If you remember during World War II, we talked about a lot of women taking jobs that were formerly held by men. So you might assume that when the men came back, they would all go back to not having those jobs. That wasn't necessarily the case. Few pursued full-time employment, and most were drastically underpaid. That is the indictment of the century. We'll talk about that more later, but their paychecks did make it possible for many families to remain in the middle class. So we'll talk more about women in the workforce in another chapter. The post-war era also saw the rise of franchise businesses. Americans supported franchises because they stressed consistent quality regardless of where they were in the United States. The example I love to use here, just because it's one that you all know, is Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A, in case you didn't know, you have to go to something called Chick-fil-A University in order to own a restaurant, be a part of the franchise, and they train all of the workers that work there to be consistent in how they speak to customers and how they work in the restaurant, and how they do all the things. And I doubt any of you have ever had like a truly horrible experience at a Chick-fil-A. Maybe you have, but I bet you'll never have another one. It might. I would assume it'll just be the one time if you have, because they are pretty consistent. Because they're consistent with their training, and that's something that they really value because they want people to trust their business and come back to it. Multinational corporations also expanded in the post-war economy. So examples of those would be Coca-Cola, General Motors, General Electric, and IBM. Hollywood films also began finding their ways overseas during this time period. I've got some cool examples of both of those things and some cool stories about that. We'll talk about those in class. The prosperity of the 1950s also was reflected generally in good times for the labor movement. So in the AFL and the CIO, united to join and form one combined labor union that just was the AFL and the CIO, hyphen in between. They had a great deal of political pull, especially with the Democratic Party. As the economy grew, so too did educational opportunities for Americans. A more educated workforce boosted economic productivity. In 1940, only 15% of college-age Americans attended college, and 20 years later, 1960, 40% of college-age Americans attended college, and that number would go up more as years go on. Large sums of money were needed, though, to meet education needs of the baby boom generation. That's a lot of kids that we have to educate all at the same time. So in the early 50s and 60s, California opened a new school every week. Most funding came from the state and local government, but Eisenhower made federal investments in education as well as the space race heated up. And he wanted to do that because he wanted a lot of that money to go to science programs. The post-war era movement to make education more accessible as well. Many states began putting money into their state university, making it more attainable for ordinary Americans to attend college. And California established something called the California Master Plan, which called for 3 tiers of higher education and different kinds of universities. And I'm assuming you can all think of examples of these, right? Research universities, state colleges, and community colleges, right? Possibly the most notable act to come from the 1950s, and this is something we will talk about a lot in our next chapter, which is the Civil Rights Movement, is the Brown v. Board of Education case, which overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, that Supreme Court case. But we will talk about that a lot in the coming chapters, so I'm going to leave it here for section 2. Make sure you're doing your quizzes, staying up to date on that, watching any videos that I assign to go along with this, because I will. It's not enough to just talk about the culture of the 50s, you really have to see it, so make sure you're watching those, and we will go over section 3 next time.